Meet The Lot, native token of Lukki Exchange and the most potential tool for investing this year. Trade now on P2B, B2B and Lukki.io.
I'd like you to raise your hand if you would loan me 10,000 euros right now. A couple over here? Anybody over here? Would you loan me 10,000 euros? A few, yeah. Thank you. That's really nice. It's not very smart, though. Reality is, you don't know me at all. We've never met. You don't know anything about my ability to repay that loan. And you can't trust me. So well done to everyone else who didn't put their hand up. When you look back on civilizations, when people lived in tiny villages, they knew everybody that they transacted with. Trust was inherent in every single interaction. But obviously, the world started to grow. Globalization happened. At some point in time, people had to transact with someone that they couldn't trust. And this was the beginning of centralized trust providers, essentially third parties or intermediaries that would sit in the center of an untrusted transaction to provide that trust. And this was really the beginning of our most organized form of society. And this is the structure that we built our entire world upon. Now, you guys have learned about the 6 Ds, right? I know the gentleman before Carla was talking about them, but here's the thing. They actually forgot that there's a 7th D. And this D is, in my opinion, more transformative than all the other 6 combined. And that is decentralize. So you've learned a little bit about this already yesterday from a couple of speakers, but today we're really going to dive in. We're going to look at how decentralization is not only changing the way we interact with each other in a society, but is actually changing the structure of society itself. So we're going to talk about how blockchain technology is what's enabling this incredible societal change. Are you guys excited? Oh, I'm so excited. I love blockchain, so I'm happy to be here. All right. So I just want to do a bit of a level set and bring everybody up to the same speed on what blockchain is. So when you think about it, blockchain is really just an infrastructure level technology. It's something that you build on top of. And there are many different blockchains out there. There's Bitcoin, there's Ethereum. They all have a few different tweaks to them that make them more effective for different use cases. But at the most core level, a blockchain is just a ledger, a record of transactions of value. So if you imagine if every financial transaction that happens in the world today between people, between banks, between stores, whatever have you, if they were all recorded in one ledger, that's kind of like a blockchain. Now what's neat about it is that these transactions are actually stored in little groups called blocks. And the blocks are linked together in the format of a chain, hence the word blockchain. Clearly the computer sciences were not really super creative when they came up with that. So what's cool about this is that each block is actually cryptographically linked to the block before it. And you can sort of think about this as though each block has a little Polaroid picture of the block before it coded right in. So if I wanted to hack a transaction and say, it didn't really happen this way, I wanted to change it up, not only would I have to hack that block, I would have to hack every single block that came after it, because otherwise it wouldn't match that little Polaroid. Now, there's a few properties that I want you to understand about blockchain. The first one is that they're public to all users. So if you've got a private blockchain that is perhaps only used by a group of banks, every person in those banks can see every single transaction. But if you have a public blockchain, like Bitcoin or Ethereum, every person in the world can see every transaction. So if you loan me $10,000, and I said, oh, you know what, I never got the money. You didn't send it to me, so I don't owe you anything. You could point to the transaction on the chain and say, no, here it is, I sent you the money. And so I can't hide behind my lies. The second property is that it's immutable, which means that once a transaction is made, it can't be edited. So I can't go back and say, okay, you lent me 10,000, but I'm just gonna edit this so it looks like it was only 1,000 and I don't owe you as much money. It's not possible. The third is that it isn't centrally owned, which means if you send me $10,000 and I'm really good friends with the CEO and creator of one of the blockchains, I can't just go to him and say, oh, hey, listen, I don't have the money to pay this guy back. Can you just turn off the blockchain? It's not possible. Even the creator of the blockchain itself cannot turn it off. But if you remember one property, the most important one is that blockchains are decentralized, which means a copy of the chain is stored on thousands of computers all over the world. And these are computers like my laptop, some guy in China's desktop. They're these individual units spread out everywhere. So even if you were able to hack that one transaction in that one block, and then every block that came after it, not only would you have to do that, you'd have to do it on at least half of all of these computers at exactly the same time. It's impossible. And for that reason, a blockchain is a single source of truth for every person on the planet. It essentially provides trust in these peer-to-peer transactions, enabling us to make these transactions at a scale that has never been previously possible. Now, do you guys recognize this gentleman? Does anybody know who this is? Yes. You are my new favorite person, wherever you are. This is Vitalik Buterin. He is one of the world's brightest minds. You should know him. He's the founder of the Ethereum blockchain. And he sums up blockchain really well. He says, whereas most technologies tend to automate workers on the periphery, doing menial tasks, blockchains automate away the center. Instead of putting the taxi driver out of a job, blockchain puts Uber out of a job and lets the drivers work with the customers directly. So when we think about our society, we've built the entire thing on these centralized intermediaries, whether it's governments, individuals, corporations. And so blockchain is going to completely change the way we structure societies by eliminating the need for these intermediaries. Now, to begin looking at what that might look like, what kind of society that we'll have when everything is decentralized, it's important to start at the very beginning with individuals. And so I ask you, what makes a human a person? And the answer to that question starts with the passport. It's actually my passport. A couple of weeks ago, I was traveling through Europe, and I had a connection in London to head back to Canada. And I got to my gate and realized I didn't have my passport on me. It must have fallen out of my pocket somewhere along the way. And so I'm freaking out, running around the airport like a crazy chicken, because I knew that if I didn't find the passport, I was going to have to get a taxi into the city, find the Canadian consulate, but it was a weekend, so it would be closed. I'd have to get a hotel, file a police report that I lost the passport, wait for them to make an emergency one, and then book a last-minute flight home. I figured all in all, it would cost me over $2,000. I started to think, it's so ridiculous that my freedom of movement is restricted by a piece of paper that can fall out of my pocket. How is that possible? But it's my identity. So what is an identity, really? It's a claim. I claim I am Anne Connelly. I have proof. Maybe here's a utility bill or a telephone bill with my name on it. And maybe there's some attestations. My mom would say, of course, that's definitely Anne Connelly. But in most cases, the attestation that we require as a society is an attestation from a government. So when there's a need for a verification of identity, the government sits as an intermediary in that transaction providing that service. Now, for me, the consequences of losing my passport were not that bad. At the end of the day, it was kind of, I'd lose some money, and that sucks, but that's on me. But that's unfortunately not the case for most people in the world. Does anybody know what this is? Yes, I love you guys. This is the best audience. This is a refugee camp. The Zaatari refugee camp at one point was home to more than 80,000 Syrians. Now, more than 70% of refugees and displaced people around the world, there's over 65 million of them, over 70% don't have the identity documentation that they need to get processed into a new country. And so they're left in limbo in places like this, and it's not for days or weeks. It's for months, years, and even generations. But the sad part is that, not that they don't have identity, but they can't even access the third party who would provide it for them, because it's back in their war-torn country. Now, more than 1 billion people around the world actually lack access to identity documentation. And sometimes that's because their governments just refuse to give it to them. In the United States, in the 1950s and 60s, if you were part of a communist organization, you were not allowed to have a passport. And today, in many Muslim countries, if you're a female, you can't get one unless a man tells you you're allowed to. So with blockchain technology, it enables you as a human being to have self-sovereignty, to be the owner of your own identity, and to create the proofs and attestations and link them into your identity so that you don't need a centralized party to provide that for you. Now, this is a very abstract concept, so I want to do a really practical example here for you to play it out. This is Pia Mancini. She and her husband Santiago Siri are two people from Argentina who are very passionate about self-sovereign identity. So when they had their daughter, Roma, they decided they wanted her to have ownership over her identity before any government did. So they made a claim, they had proof, and they had attestations. And this is what that looked like.
Hello, this video is the birth certificate of Roma Siri. So here is Roma Siri. This is Roma with her little friend Pantufla. Roma was born in the UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital. Here you can see her full name, Roma Siri. She was born at this hospital on November 6, 2015 at 2020 hours in the city of San Francisco, planet Earth. Her mother is
Pia Mancini. I was born in Buenos Aires, 12 May 1982.
and her father is me, Santiago Siri, Argentinian, born October 1st, 1983. We have two witnesses, Roma's grandmothers.
I'm Pela Herrero. I was born in Argentina, in Salta, in October the 2nd, 1952.
And the other witness,
I am Maria Marta Estrada, grandmother of Roma. I was born in Buenos Aires, May 30, 19.
and to prove the timestamp, here we have the last block of the blockchain.
So he used the last block of the blockchain to prove the rough timing of when the child was actually born. So they uploaded this video to blockchain and used it essentially as the basis upon which the rest of her identity would be built over time. So I want to give you an example of why this type of identity really matters. This woman is named Rahaf Mohammed. You may have read about her a couple of weeks ago. She's an 18-year-old woman. Problem was, when she got to Thailand, the Thai government actually confiscated her passport at the behest of the Saudi government. So to avoid being deported back to her family, she barricaded herself in a hotel room and refused to leave until the UNHCR came to get her. Now, she's living in Canada now, so she's safer than she was before. But the reality is none of this would have happened if she had access to a self-sovereign identity. She could have shown up at any airport, given access to all the identity documentation that was stored on blockchain with access to any internet-connected device, a phone, a computer, anywhere in the world. So the Saudi Arabian government could not have revoked her passport because they didn't like her traveling as a female. It would not be possible. And so for me, when I lost my passport, I was going to lose some money. For Rahaf, she would have been deported back to Saudi Arabia where she would have been killed. So this is the importance of why self-sovereignty and decentralized identity is so critical. I think we can all agree certain governments in the world are better than others. I come from a place where, society works relatively well, and based on what I've seen in Spain, it seems pretty good also. But today, what I really want you to do is take yourself out of your own society, take yourself out of the world you are living in, and put yourself in the shoes of someone who lives in a country whose government doesn't work well at all. Like Venezuela, where right now the inflation rate is more than 2.3 million%. And it's expected to hit more than 10 million% this year. Now, these numbers are kind of unimaginably huge. They're insane. So to put it in perspective, if you had $1 million US 5 years ago to invest, and you invested them in the Venezuelan Bolivare, you would have, your investment would be worth 37 cents today. So imagine the impact that has on the life savings of someone who is trying to keep their family alive. The average worker in Venezuela, making the median wage, will only make enough money at the end of the day to buy 2 eggs and nothing else. So what started as a financial crisis has now become a humanitarian emergency. People are starving. More than 15% of Venezuelans are actually eating garbage as a regular part of their diet. And things have gotten so bad that more than 7% of the country has actually left, a number that is pretty equal to the migration of Syrians that we recently saw. Now, those who are sticking around are desperate for a store of value that doesn't have the government as a third party. A lot of people are going back to the mines to try to look for gold, and Bitcoin sales are exploding. Because for the first time ever, people have the opportunity to transact digitally without having a government in the way. It's really the beginning of the separation of money and state. Now, as we know, in most financial transactions, it's not just the government that's in the middle, it's also a lot of people in the financial sector. We've got banks that are there. How many people here work for financial services? Yeah, like definitely a few. This is the bank accounts of Guaido. He said, because I know you, I know the CEO of this bank, I can have him shut off your accounts. If he had his money in Bitcoin, this would not be possible, because the blockchain would provide the trust instead of that centralized party. So when you look at the financial sector and the banks moving forward, what is the role of a bank in a world where centralized intermediaries are no longer required? It's something to think about. Okay, but the reality is many of the centralized intermediaries that we have are not actually government. They are corporations. When you think about the identity that's provided, one of the identities I use a lot is Google. I sign into everything with Google. But when I'm doing that, I give them my email and my password, but the reality is I'm actually giving them a whole lot more information than I know. When you look at Facebook, Facebook is able to detect when you're about to get in a relationship, who that relationship is with, and how long it's going to last. It's crazy. And then they use that information to market engagement rings, which is fine, but the reality is they're actually using that data for a whole lot of other things. We all remember that they sold it to Cambridge Analytica, that directly impacted getting Trump elected. But where this really starts to matter is when you get into data like DNA. Has anybody done their 23andMe? Or some, yeah. So I did that a couple years ago. It was super interesting. But I knew what I was doing. I knew what was going to happen to my data. I mean, 23andMe has already sold my data to GlaxoSmithKline. And it happened. Anyway. But I want to share a bit of a story to kind of paint the picture of the dangers of this type of centralization. So I want you to imagine that you're applying for a job, and you willingly hand over information like your name and your email and your employment record. But the company wants to know more. And so they go to 23andMe and they buy your genetic profile. They look through it and realize that you're at a high risk of getting breast cancer. And they know that you're 28, 29, they might get a year out of you before you start to get it, and then you're going to miss a lot of work. And you're going to drain the resources on their insurance policy, so they don't hire you. This is totally feasible in the world that we live in today. But with a blockchain-based system, the individual is the owner of their own data. So I control it. So if I want to open up access to different snippets of my DNA and give them for free to a research group doing something in Alzheimer's, I can do that. I can also open it up to someone doing research in cancer and get paid for that data. I can also decide I never want to open it up at all. But the most important part is not that I can open it, but that I can revoke that access at any point in time. And this is really critical because a lot of groups in the world right now are pushing to have data ownership as a human right. I think this is awesome, but I think it's totally impossible in the world we live in today. Because once your data is out there, you can never get it back. And you have to trust these companies are going to store it and use it ethically, which we know is not happening. But with blockchain, it's 100% possible, which is very exciting for the future of data. But the thing is, most of us in this room have choices. We don't have to do 23andMe. We don't have to use Facebook. We choose to. But for some people around the world, that choice isn't really there. So this is Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt in January of 2011. Now, more than 2 million people came to the public square to protest the actions of President Mubarak, who'd been accused of corruption and trying to squash freedom of speech across the country. Going to a public square is really dangerous. You can get arrested, you can get injured, you can get killed. In this protest alone, more than 1,000 people died. Now, with the advent of the internet, it brought something really exciting. It brought about a digital public square, where you could start to voice your opinion about your government with much significantly less risk than you would if you had to go out in the physical square. Now, a lot of these protests are actually organized on Facebook. But the problem with Facebook and other social media sites is they are centralized. And so in cases in Pakistan and Turkey and Bahrain, the government actually shut off social media. And they could do this because they only had to go to one place. But if you had a social media site that looked and felt just like the ones we use today, but where the data was based on blockchain, it would travel across those thousands of computers around the world, and there would be no central place that a government could go to turn off the voice of their people. Blockchain can help with this as well. If you use something called a blockchain-based mesh network, essentially, as long as one person has access to the internet, maybe through a satellite connection or from across the border, if you all the way at the back want to send something through the internet and I'm the only one with a connection, you can send that data up through the phones of all the people that you're sitting nearby until I get it and I send it out. And everyone who participates gets a micropayment of cryptocurrency for providing a part of that route. Now, if you think this kind of stuff only happens in Egypt, you may have read the news last week that Vladimir Putin is doing a trial to turn off all the internet in Russia. But don't worry, it's just a test. They're never going to use it. Now, some governments are actually getting on board in a really cool way. Canadian government's looking at applications, but Estonia is really the one that we need to look to. They've been working with blockchain technology for over a decade and have had production-level applications since 2012. And they're looking at it for things like identity, but also for data, e-services, all kinds of things, which is very exciting. So I want to come back to this example of our refugees. If we had refugees living in this amazing decentralized world with services like Estonia has, imagine fleeing from your war-torn town and arriving at a place like this with nothing but the clothes on your back. You can open access to your decentralized ID from anybody's phone, prove who you are and where you came from almost instantly, making it much easier to get processed into a new country. And because all of your savings are in cryptocurrency, you can easily cross borders with it, meaning that getting set up in your new country is going to be much less of a burden on the country that is taking you in. Also, you can have certified educational certificates on the blockchain, proving that you do have the education that you say you do, and will be much more job ready when you need to join the workforce. This is the power of blockchain. But the reality is, this impact can happen right here in Spain. Cryptocurrency can help a woman who's fleeing an abusive relationship and needs a bank account that can't be shut down by anyone. Can help somebody who doesn't want to be discriminated against because they have genes for Alzheimer's or cancer. This is really what gets me excited. But the thing is, the most important part about decentralization is not looking about how we can remove governments and corporations, because the biggest intermediary in the world today is actually us. Human beings are the intermediary in a robot-to-robot economy. So right now, we are the only thing stopping robots from communicating directly, and blockchain technology is going to enable that to happen. So we just talked a lot about self-driving cars. Let's imagine that a car comes to pick you up in the morning, and it says, do you want to get there quickly or cheaply or safely? What's your priority and what's your budget? And so you type in, you're like, I'm in a hurry, I need to get there fast. And so it pays to use the fast lane on the highway. Some of that money might go back to the city to help maintain the roads. It'll pay the cars in front of it to move out of its way so it can zip by. Maybe it will pay the street light to turn green so you can get to your location on time. This is the future and the potential. But the thing is, this car is self-sovereign. It has its own crypto wallet. It manages its own maintenance, orders its own parts. In fact, and a drone will pick up the package from the depot and fly it to the car. The car will verify the identity of the drone, and if the identity matches, then the window of the car will open. The drone will then fly in the window, drop the box with the part in it, and a smart contract will make the transaction, sending the money back to the seller. The drone goes back to the depot. The car can then drive itself to a mechanic shop where another robot will actually install the part. So imagine all of the different machines that you have in your life that could take on this type of identity, this type of self-sovereignty, and essentially become an active member in the society that we have created. Which begs the question, what is the role of humans in this new world? This is the greatest challenge that our humanity will ever face. Because the reality is, 99.9% of the disruption that blockchain will bring has not happened yet. It has not happened. So I want you to think about your industry, your technology, government, corporations, banking as a company, to adapt in a world where you are no longer required in the process you have built your entire empire upon. Now, at the beginning of this presentation, I asked you if you would loan me $10,000. And some of you said yes, and that was really nice. But the reality is, the person who will be lending me the $10,000 probably won't be in this room. They might be in Kenya or China or Australia, but that transaction will still be peer-to-peer. We won't need a bank to make it happen. And maybe the entity that's actually loaning me the money is not human at all. It's a machine, like the self-driving car, that made some money that morning doing a job that humans used to do. Now, this is a crazy shift, but every great shift starts with small actions. So I'm going to issue a challenge to all of you. This weekend, when you go home, I want everyone to go out and buy a single euro's worth of Bitcoin. Who will commit to doing this? To taking the first step in this crazy new world? That's great. I'm not saying it won't be challenging. It'll be a challenge, but I think you're going to love it. And for many of you, it will be a glimpse into this new future world, one where we don't have government or corporations at the center of our transactions, but we have blockchain and we have trust. Thanks very much.